record to the cloud. All right. So to introduce our speaker tonight, Richard obtained a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Saskatchewan in 1985 and a PhD in wildlife epidemiology from the University of Guelph in 1992. Over the past 3 decades, he has been actively involved in biodiversity conservation in Alberta, working at the interface between science and policy. From 2002 to 2006, he served as conservation director and then the executive director for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's Northern Alberta chapter. For the next 13 years, he was a senior researcher in the Integrated Landscape Management Lab at the University of Alberta. In 2019, he published Biodiversity Conservation in Canada, From Theory to Practice, which is now being used as a text by conservation students across the country. Taking on the role of the executive director with Nature Alberta in 2020, Richard has returned to his roots in the conservation community. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you. So I'm gonna go and share my screen now.
Yes.
Is that coming through okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Kethu, and welcome everyone. In our magazine, we try to provide a balance between good news stories and in conservation and some of the tougher ones. This is one of the tough ones. So I'm afraid this is a little bit of a difficult story for those that are passionate about nature, but I feel it's good for everybody to understand all the details, and certainly this is one of the top most difficult species in the province across Canada, really. Some of the southern prairie species are really struggling as well, but in the boreal, I mean, it's caribou, it's a highest profile species we have up there. So I'm going to walk you through my perspective on what's happened, like why have our caribou declined? What have we done? So it's a bit of a retrospective to give you a sense for what's been tried and then take you into the present day to let you know where things are at and try to help you understand why is it so hard and why haven't we made more progress? And there'll be a few questions I'll pose for you, a couple of points along the way, because there are some things here that don't have clear answers. Even as a conservationist, you have to say, what should we do here? How should we go forward? So I'm going to pause for those and just let you think about them as we go along, and end off with just a few ideas for how everyone can participate or help move things forward. So I'm sure with this audience here, you all know we're talking about woodland caribou in Alberta, not the barren ground caribou that typically the sort of Dave Attenborough shows focus on. Our caribou are forest dwelling, always have been. They don't migrate very much, back and forth a little bit, especially in the mountains. They go up and down, but basically we're talking about a woodland species here. And their habitat, it depends. In the boreal, they actually focus more on the vast peatlands. We have almost a third of the boreal is wet in some form or another, and that's where caribou tend to hang out. In the foothills and mountains, they're more focused on older stages of forest. So give you a sense of that. What they like to eat, something they do different than most other ungulates, is they do just fine on lichen. In fact, they've got a reindeer lichen named after them. Ground lichens, also arboreal lichen. They can eat and make a living on this stuff, whereas not a lot of other species can. Of course, they eat other things, but this is kind of what sets them apart. And as you'll see, it's a kind of crucial piece to the puzzle. Now, they share their habitat with a number of other species. I'm not obviously going to focus on all of them, but there's a few key players in the story, if you will, of how caribou make a living and why they're in trouble here. So one of their species they live with is white-tailed deer. Not so much in the Boreal, obviously, but farther north you go, the less there are white-tailed deer there are, but they are actually steadily moving up there. And certainly in the foothills, you'll find them. In the far north, like Wood Buffalo Park, we have bison, always had. Now, of course, they've shrunk down a lot too, but they're still up there in isolated spots, mostly around Wood Buffalo. And the lead player is this fellow, moose, ubiquitous across both the Boreal and foothills areas. It is the main species that caribou interact with in terms of the ecological niche that they play as a herbivore. Now, what ties all these species together and why I've been picking on the ungulates is the wolf, because it preys on all of these species. And you'll see this is what binds them all together into the same puzzle. Wolves can and do take down animals as large as bison, and wood buffalo, they do it all the time. Not that it's easy, but they can. So you might ask yourselves, what chance does a caribou have? It's roughly the same size as a deer, a little bit bigger. And the answer is not much, not much of a chance. Wolves can and do take down caribou quite easily. So how do they survive? If they're not big enough to really defend for themselves, like moose and bison, even though they are killed by wolves, they stand a fighting chance. Wolves can't take them down all the time. Caribou aren't big enough to do that, nor do they have the reproductive capacity of deer. Deer on average put out twins, sometimes triplets even, right? So they can reproduce their way out of predation, if you will. Caribou can't. They only produce one young per year, and their populations are generally naturally low. These aren't, like I said, this huge herds that you see up in the north. These are small groups of animals just widely dispersed in forest habitats. So their secret power is invisibility, if you will. They hide. This is where we come back to their habitat preferences. They cannot really withstand a lot of predation. They never could, but they've been with wolves for the last 10,000 years. Since the last glaciers left, they've been doing just fine together. And the reason is that caribou go where other ungulates don't. So you have moose and to a lesser extent deer and bison. That's what the wolves really depend on. They're in significant numbers throughout the forest, and so you really have a wolf-moose system in most areas. And the caribou focus in the Boreal onto these large peatlands. And I think I have a photo here. This photo is meant to show that what the moose like to eat is especially after a fire, the flush of young growth, they're browsers. They eat the leaves and the twigs of trees. When you get a disturbed site and the undergrowth comes popping up, this is like a buffet for moose. They love that. But when you get to areas like the peatlands, it doesn't work the same. So they have coexisted for a long time. Caribou hiding out in areas where there aren't really any moose, or not very many, and wolves just don't bother to look for them because there aren't enough of them to make it worth their while. And yet, over the last less than 100 years, they've declined precipitously. And I mean, flushing down pretty darn quickly. And so their populations have reached a critical state. Many of the herds are barely viable at this stage in Alberta. And it's not just us, but we certainly are the poster child for problematic caribou. So whereas caribou used to range across all of the forested parts of Alberta, their ranges have contracted during this period as their populations decline. The range has contracted and fragmented. So now we talk about roughly 14 or so ranges where you're likely to find still caribou today. And, they've been numbered and we've radio tagged them. We kind of know where they range from year to year. There's some movement, of course, but roughly speaking, this map shows where they are. We're talking talking in a ballpark of 3,000, probably less today. That number is a little bit dated. And as I said, roughly 13 herds. So why? What wolves are the proximate cause. They are eating the caribou, but they've been together for thousands of years. Why now? And the reason is that we as humans have transformed the forest. And we've done that in a number of ways. Forestry, certainly the number one cause. As we go and harvest trees, we're basically making the forest younger. And remember what I said about moose loving young disturbed sites. So we are producing a tremendous amount of browse, and it works. We're producing more moose than we had in the past because there are more, on average, more spots that have young trees and therefore more food for moose. We've also been really busy with oil and gas. So the first step there is always, cutting seismic lines. You probably come across them if in your travels in the outbacks. They used to be 8 meters wide. Now they're narrower, but there's those long linear paths through the forest are the first stage. And then once they find oil, they clear roughly a hectare of forest to put a well. And this map here, as a Google map, shows you what it looks like when you add the small disturbances over time. So this is somewhere west of Edmonton. These big patches here, I think you can see my mouse. Is that true, Kelly? Okay, so these big patches here are clear cuts. Long linear ones, I mean, this is probably a road. All these here are lines are access roads going to a well site. So pretty much every well site has a road going to it. And it doesn't show up here so much on this figure, but the seismic lines are crisscrossed throughout the whole thing. So if that was just one spot, it'd be fine. But here's a map of the oil wells across Alberta. It covers the majority of the province, with the exception of the Northwest. There isn't any oil up here where Wood Buffalo Park is, and so on. And it peters out as you go. It's just the geology of Alberta. So we've been up to the NWT border with oil wells, and of course, down to the southern prairies. So there aren't remote chunks. Turns out this Wood Buffalo Park, unfortunately, it's not great caribou habitat. So there's a few in there, but this, if you remember my map, there wasn't a range in there. So the area that's intact isn't actually good caribou habitat. They are really overlapping in this area of high human disturbance. And in case you're interested what it looks like compared to the rest of Canada, certainly there's been a lot in the south. We are unique though, and this area here, if you look at where I'm drawing my mouse around here, this is a gas more than anything, gas deposits. So it goes into the northeast BC. And that's what's different. You don't see that in Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Northern Ontario. They don't have any gas. So what you're seeing down here is forestry or farming in the southern parts. But Alberta is unique in terms of having this footprint of oil and gas, and behind it, in its wake, if you will, forestry came. And once the roads are in, and they kind of feed on each other. So there isn't a lot of undisturbed habitat left in Alberta, and that's why our herds are more trouble than some of the rest. So if you're a caribou and, we're down at the ground level here, and again, you hear these are 1 hectare clearings for wells and the roads going to them. Well, we know by putting collars, radio collars on the caribou and tracking where they go, that they avoid these features. The closer you get, the less likely it is you'll ever see a caribou. It's not like they never go there, but it's an avoidance. They don't go there as often. So from the perspective of a caribou, once you take that buffer away of areas they don't go, you're left with these fragments of good habitat. So even though the landscape is there, the amount that's really good quality habitat for a caribou is much less than it might appear, because they're avoiding these human disturbance features. The other thing is that I said wolves are quite important to the story here. They, again, people have been radio collaring wolves, and they like to walk along these seismic lines and ditches of roads and so on. So they have got highways to move much more quickly than they used to be able to move when it was sort of an all intact forest. So that's another piece to it. And the third and the biggest is back to what I mentioned earlier, this interrelationship between moose, particularly other ungulates, but mainly moose, and wolves and caribou. So what we're doing is we're reducing the amount of older forest, intact forest, all these cuts are producing younger forest. That is allowing more moose to reproduce faster. There's a higher density of moose on the landscape. That is it gives more food for wolves, their primary predator. And then caribou are just stuck in the middle. As I said, they tend to just hide out, go away from the areas where moose tend to hang out. But once you get so many moose and wolves in the landscape all the time, just chance encounters increase. And caribou can't take a lot of predation. As I said, their reproduction rate is low. So it doesn't take much to get them to the level where they're not making enough babies to, sustain themselves year after year. And that's the main driver of what's going on here. So just to sum that up, I'm quoting here from a biologist, extensive timber harvest since the 1950s has altered large areas of caribou habitat. Early successional stages developed, more moose and more stable wolf population. The take-home message was, unless immediate intensive management is applied, caribou numbers and distribution will continue to shrink. So the interesting part about this quote sort of sums up what I've said. Many studies have been done since then that verify this. This was written by Jan Edwards in 1988, 35 years ago. We knew what the problem was, and we knew what the solution was 35 years ago. So this is not a science problem where we don't know what to do. This is a political problem. It's a deep trade-off between resource development and conservation. Those are certainly the toughest to deal with. So what have we done? Here's the retrospective. In the 70s and 80s, it was really wildlife managers, like working for the government. Wildlife managers were at the helm, and somebody who was in charge, like Janet Edmonds would be one, others, their job is to get caribou back on track. They knew the numbers were declining, and their job was to rectify that. So one of the first things they did was to list it as a threatened species in the province in 1985, and they stopped sport hunting. Those were, I often think of management levers, like if you're in one of these digging machines, you can pull this and it'll turn, and pull that and it'll go the other way, the bucket go up. Well, as managers, you have levers, things that you can affect a change. So as a biologist working for the government, you could say, yeah, I'm in control of hunting. I'm going to pull the hunting lever and stop it. And they could do that. They could list it as an endangered species or a threatened species. So they did that. As you see, that wasn't enough. That was a start, but it wasn't enough. And then when we went into the 90s, those of you with as much gray hair as I have, you may remember the time in the 90s where we had the war in the woods across the country, right? People were getting carried off to jail, especially in BC, but Ontario, Alberta had huge protests over the alpaca mill at that time. Anyway, it was a real pivotal point in the history of conservation, where people became much more directly engaged. I mean, the whole environmental movement started in the 70s, but it's when it took a while, for that bus really to get rolling. And by the 90s, you had environmental groups. If you look at the history of groups in Alberta or across Canada, they all started in the 60s, 70s. They got going, and then with the war in the woods, it became a lot of pressure to get people involved. They wanted to have a say. They weren't accepting this idea of, a manager somewhere saying, trust us, we're going to take care of whatever, species or whatever it was. They wanted to be at the table. They wanted to be involved in making the decisions. And that was, sort of came out of that war in the woods. Now, caribou weren't any different. So in the 90s and into the 2000s, that's when we started seeing here in Alberta stakeholder groups We had various kinds of committees, task forces, and it changed over the years. There were different, variations of them. But basically, we had committees where you had different stakeholders come together and try to decide, what are we going to do about caribou? Now, very quickly, it became evident that we had two camps inside those committees. You had the conservation groups, you had Indigenous people, you had the wildlife biologists. They were called, simply put, pro caribou, saying these are the things we need to do to save caribou. And on the other side, you had forestry companies, you had oil and gas companies, you had some local municipalities like Hinton saying, yeah, no way, our town depends on this forestry. So they were on the other side, and they were at loggerheads. They couldn't. They were in an impasse. They couldn't make a decision that everybody accepted. They were sort of equally weighted, if you will. And this was in Klein's time, especially Ralph Klein. The government at that time had this hands-off attitude. They didn't want to take these political hard decisions and do something. So they said, hey, we're setting up these committees. You guys decide. But in fact, it was decision by indecision because they couldn't agree. And so best that came out of that was a lot of research, tons of money. So the resource companies, they were not prepared to put habitat aside, which the biologist had said, years ago is what we should do. They said, well, we're not doing that. But what we'll do is put millions, like the millions of dollars into research. One of the best studied species in the country is caribou. They've done a lot of research, I guess, in the hope that maybe we'll find a win-win solution. Maybe if we look hard enough, we'll find a way to keep cutting and maintain caribou viability. Or a cynic would say it's the talk and log kind of thing. We'll do research, we'll look like we're doing something, but in fact we're just stalling. So you can decide what that was. We don't know on what was in their minds. Anyway, now we move into the 2010s. Still a stalemate, and wildlife managers, what it turned out is that they lacked the authority. They didn't have their hand on the key lever, which was forestry. They couldn't. They had no voice even within government, even though they're a government department. They couldn't say, we need to reduce logging in old growth forest. Well, they did say it, but they didn't listen because there was some other department in charge of deciding how much forestry happens and where it happens. It was not the wildlife biologists. So they had no authority to do that. And the conservation groups, they just didn't have the political power. They couldn't somehow push through and say, do this or else, because there was no or else. And so it was a stalemate. And in the meantime, the populations year by year declined. So that said, it's going to be a bit of a hard talk. At this time, sort of where I come into the picture, when I was at the University of Alberta at the time, and with a group of other researchers in an integrated landscape management lab, and we said, let's look at the facts, and we put them down here on paper. It's time that we all accept the fact that we are at a management impasse. It's been 20 years of endless committees and guidelines and ideas that had no teeth. That isn't working. Number two, let's accept the fact. Everybody, let's accept the fact that caribou and industry just they can't coexist. Some things can't. Peregrines can live just fine in the middle of Edmonton, but caribou aren't like that. They actually need intact forests. That's one of the reasons why it's so tough. So let's not hold out for that holy grail that there's some kind of guideline that maybe if we don't harvest during this month, it'll all be okay. After so much time, we're in the 2010s now, let's just accept it ain't going to happen. They need full protection. That habitat needs to be completely protected for them to, turn around from steadily declining year by year into actually thriving. Number three, let's accept that protecting all habitat of all caribou herds is politically infeasible. It essentially means shutting down the entire oil sands, which is the lifeblood, well, at that time for sure, of our government budget. So even though from a caribou perspective, and I personally would love to see every hectare protected, realistically, the government's deciding what's going to happen, and they're not going to protect the habitat of every herd everywhere. It ain't going to happen. So let's accept that. And then lastly, let's accept that focusing our management strategy on the most endangered herds was a poor one from the perspective of the entire population of the province. So I use the bathtub analogy here. You see, the goal at that time, especially particularly from the conservation groups, but government as well, was that we were going to maintain every caribou herd in the province. We were going to keep them all. But some of them were really, really in a tough spot. Like Little Smoky herd was, down to around 60 animals, just on the precipice of disappearing. So to keep a herd alive that's down to that, just on the edge of extirpation, that takes a tremendous effort. So what was happening is, if your mandate is to keep every herd, then you can't lose. The most endangered one is where you have to put your energy, because you can't lose that. You lose that one, you've lost the overall goal of protecting all the herds. The trouble is, in the meantime, some of these herds that are slowly declining but are viable with solid effort, they don't get the attention. It's all going to the herds that are really just on death's door. So we thought, this is ripe for the triage approach, where you look at the entire province instead of individual herds and say, given those realities that I just mentioned, what is the best thing to do? The triage, just to remind you, if you haven't heard that word for a while, it comes from the wartime application, where on the front line, sometimes there weren't the resources to adequately treat all of the soldiers who had been injured. So they would come in, and some of them that were in rough shape, but they're going to make it, they're put aside, no treatment, because odds were they're going to make it. Others were so badly shot up, doesn't really matter what you would do, they were going to die, and they were left also untreated. And then in the middle was the group that really struggling, but with enough attention could be brought back and would survive. So that is the general concept, and it's been applied now to conservation. And our thinking was it fit the province very well. So we have a limited amount of resources. We can't protect all of the herds in the province fully in terms of making parks for all of them. So let's look at the entire province and say, if we have a limited amount of protection available, where are we going to put it? So we did a bunch of modeling. That's what people like me like to do. And so we tried to do that triage thing. Like, how do you decide? And the soldiers, a medical doctor would make the assessment. Yeah, this one's going to make it, this one not, and so on. Caribou, how do you decide which ones are the best ones and are most viable and which aren't? So we used 3 different criteria. One was, the map on the left is how much disturbance is there within their range. Some of them areas are really hammered very hard. Some are almost intact. So we use that as an input. The ones that are more intact, those herds are going to be more viable than the ones that are really in an area that's been hammered hard. Second map was climate change. So some places are going to transition fairly quickly into a climate that resembles that around Edmonton, especially like the Peace Country and lower lying areas. And some are going to take a long time and probably will remain as boreal for the long term. So that's, if you're a caribou, that makes a big deal. That's a big difference, sorry. And the last thing was resource value, especially here, if this big area right here, that's the oil sands, right? And we're talking about, multi-billion, even today, still billions of dollars sitting there underground. So if you're, the east side Athabasca herd here, you've got a really bad go of it here, because you happen to pick an area which is extremely conflicted with high value resources. So putting those 3 things together, we had an optimization model. We said, okay, it's not up to us to tell anybody how much caribou habitat to protect. Again, if it was up to me, we'd protect it all. But as scientists, we're not decision makers. We inform decisions. So what we did is ask the computer model to give us a variety of different scenarios. And here's the map. So we said, look, if we can only protect 20% of the land, where would you protect it? And it turns out that's areas that are already protected. Like this is the Caribou Mountains here, and little bits here, the Rocky Mountain parts. But of course, we won't hopefully going to go more. So, okay, computer, tell us if you would protect 40% of all caribou range in the province, where would it be? And that's in this intermediate shade of red. Okay, and then let's go crazy. Let's protect 60% of all caribou range in the province. And now that's this lighter color. So the high value area around the oil sands isn't part of that 60%, but these areas up here where there's much less resource value and less danger. I mean, they were all three of these things were weighted equally in terms of viability for the future and climate change too. So this is the map. And we said, look, we're not telling you how much to protect, but this is what, where you should put them if you do protect them. We published that. And the key message going forward was if you use this approach, you could fully protect, make a park and throw all industry out of 60% of caribou range in the province and still maintain access to 90% of the value of the resources. Right? People always say, we can't do this. It's like people are throwing everybody out of jobs and our economy is going in the toilet. Ain't so. I mean, this is what we showed is that you can actually protect a very large, substantial 60% of the caribou range, not all of it, right here, but a lot. And you can still, you got your cake and eat it too. And why? That's because the resources aren't equally distributed everywhere. There's not this layer of oil equally distributed across northern Alberta. Like I say, it's Fort McMurray, and that's where a lot of it is, and a few other things. Forestry doesn't really count. And so what you can do is skirt around that and still maintain access to the high value and protect caribou at the same time. So, we were pretty proud. This is a good message. So what happened? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And for some good reasons. So the conservation community says, you know what, this really stinks. And the reason is several reasons, but the big one was, we just don't trust government very much. And, this is another talk, but there have been a large number of things that happened where, trust was eroded by government not doing things like forest conservation strategy. I urge any of you to go and find it anywhere on the internet. It doesn't exist. We went through 3 years of planning, and then they said, no, we're not going to do that, and just stop. So, conservation group says, you know what, this idea of triage, whether they accept it or not, they said, look, what assurance do we have that the government isn't just going to write off the really struggling herds and never quite get around to making those protected areas for the viable herds? There's really not a good trust that would happen. And so if you don't have the trust, well, the whole thing falls apart. Some people came forward and said, there's a big problem with the loss of genetic diversity. Some of those herds, especially around the foothills, maybe they have genetic adaptations for mountainous habitat living. And if we lose them, we lose those special genes. So that was important. And then for the government, if you look at it through their eyes, if you can sort of imagine the premier standing up to a podium and saying, we're going to allow Little Smoky herd to become extirpated. Goodbye, Little Smoky. It's a tough decision. We have to make trade-offs. We can't have everything. So Little Smoky dies. Well, that you're not going to get a minister to say that. It's very difficult. And they didn't want to go anywhere near this. We had really no uptake at all. It's much easier to just say nothing or say, oh, we're doing everything we can. We have all these planning teams and these research initiatives. We're working really hard to save caribou. The reality is they're slowly declining, but you don't mention that. That is a lot easier sell than talking about social trade-offs. So they didn't want to go here. And last but not least, you actually couldn't do this under Species at Risk Act. Sarah says you can't allow any herds to go. So it was an idea. It didn't go very far. So let's change tracks. Now we're going to switch over to the federal recovery strategy. Remember, up to this point, we've been talking only about the province of Alberta. So we're talking about provincial wildlife managers and provincial groups and years and decades of talking and doing research, but really no substantive change on the ground and caribou declining. So in 2002, Species at Risk Act became law, and a year after, woodland caribou, one of the very first species to be listed as a threatened species. And again, not going to go into Species at Risk Act in any detail, but it has some teeth, not as many as you might hope, actually, but it does have some teeth, and it requires certain things to be done by law. And I skip over those details. It actually took a while, but a decade later, we finally got a federal caribou recovery plan. And its goal was to maintain viable herds across all ranges. This was across boreal, but my focus is here on Alberta, and it applied to us. This changed the game because the lack of meaningful recovery efforts, there's no higher court. As an Albertan, you go to the premier and say, well, I'm not happy with your results, and shrug and say, well, we're trying hard, even though they may not be really trying hard. Well, now the feds are coming in and saying, you know what, that actually isn't enough. You've got to do more than that. And we have the Species at Risk Act, in our pocket here that says you have to. So that changed the game. The key part of that federal recovery strategy was that it took a very hard line. This is unique. This was blazing new ground here. And unfortunately, most other recovery plans don't go into this level of detail or this hard of a edge on what they're asking for. But in caribou, it did. It took a hard line on saying you've got to protect critical habitat. You have to do this. Now, to help them decide what critical habitat was and how much protection was needed, these are all unanswered questions, and unfortunately, a lot of recovery strategies, they leave it at that. They say things like protect critical habitat, but nobody knows what to do with it. Well, they got an expert panel together and had a quite careful look, and what they determined was that the most important factor for caribou was the level of disturbance within the range. That was the overriding factor that was behind their declines. And not only that, they went a step further, which was, again, really unique. They said, we recommend a target of keeping every range to have a target of 65% undisturbed. Okay, so everybody across Canada where there is a range, you now had your marching orders. Your job was to figure out how you could keep 65% of that range intact. Now, the problem was they are already past that. We'll get to that in a minute, but that was the target. And so here's one of those questions you might ask yourself. I'm not going to answer it here, but I'll pose it for you. How is it that an expert panel picked this number, and how justified is it? It represents a 60% probability of a herd remaining viable. Where did that 60% come from? It's quite arbitrary, to be honest, but it was really important. It's the problem, and nobody ever wants to make those decisions, and so you end up with nebulous protect critical habitat without knowing what that means. And industry will right away, if you do not have clarity about exactly what you want to do, they're not going to move. So this, everybody understood. We're talking about not 63, not 64, 65% is what your target is to have undisturbed, rightly or wrongly. But there is an underlying kind of squishy part to that. I've always wondered that. Anyway, but it is actually, I think, one of the critical things that has helped move this whole thing forward. Now, the last piece that's important here is that the feds said, and there was not just a recovery strategy, but there was a whole bunch of ancillary policy documents that came out that clarified exactly what does critical habitat mean and what can you do and so on. And they gave the provinces to 2017. Remember, this was 2012, so 5 years. They were given 5 years to develop range plans. So basically, okay, so the thing is this, the feds have the Species at Risk Act. It's a federal act, but the provinces have control of resources. So they're in control of forestry, oil and gas, and caribou for that matter, as a resource. So the feds, aren't going to march in here and start dictating what Miller Western does in terms of its forestry planning. That's a jurisdictional problem. All what they can do is to say to the provinces, including Alberta, show us how you're going to meet this federal act. So provinces have to meet federal acts all the time. Of course, they hate it, but they have to do it. But it's up to them to figure out how. So that's what happened here. Fed said, provinces, tell us how you're going to do that. I just want to get back to this here. This is the underpinning data for the decisions that that expert team, which evolved into the species or worked together with the species recovery team. What we have here is all of the herds across Canada that have been studied, and there's quite a few. You see every dot is a herd somewhere in Canada. And we've been radio collaring these herds for literally decades. And so this graph shows you the total disturbance for a herd. So in this herd right here, we've got about 80% of that range has been disturbed. Okay. And on this axis, we have recruitment. In other words, how many babies are the caribou moms pumping out every year in the range? So the answer in this one is not a lot. And you can transform this mathematically into a probability of long-term survival, which is what they did. But the point here is these are really solid data. This line is not, there's no hesitation around this. The more disturbance you have, the tougher you're looking as far as a herd, and lower your recruitment. So the team, this expert panel, and then the recovery team says, yeah, we're going to pick a number around here. Any more than that, that's just too low of a recruitment. These herds are not going to survive. Why did they pick this one and not this one or that one? I don't know. They never say. If there's a feasibility problem up here, but it's a number. It has justification, but why exactly that number? I don't think anybody really knows. Okay, so Alberta waited till pretty much the last minute to submit their plan. They didn't do the individual plans, but in that time limit. Remember, they had 5 years, but they did this province-wide plan that says this is how we're going to achieve that 65% target. So they're willing to play ball. The heart of it, and you can, this plan is up on the web if you want to look at the details there, but the heart of it was, we're going to do an integrated landscape management system that collectively achieves the 65% undisturbed target. And that would include an optimized access network, so how the roads are structured, and an aggregated harvest. I'll talk about these individually, and some additional measures. So this is actually pretty cool, because going back to the like the 2010s, 2008 was the time of the land use framework when it was developed. And a core part of that was always to develop a cumulative effect strategy. Because upper northern Alberta, it was Wild West. There was no coordination. Company A would build a road here, Company B would road there, and seismic lines, slicing and dicing, everything. There was no master plan. That was sort of like maybe something Norway would do, but we're more like Texas, where it's freedom. And so we really had this discoordinated approach, and the land use framework was supposed to work towards a way of planning and in a rational way that would help balance environmental protection with resource development. So, okay, this is taken straight from that 2017 range plan. On the left, you see kind of what it's like today. And remember, I showed you those aerial photos. So this is not an exaggeration. This is what it looks like across a lot of the north. So the the lines here are, I believe these red pinkish ones are maybe seismic lines. The black here are these well sites. And they're buffered around, because remember, their wildlife is avoiding these areas. This is kind of what it's like today. They said with optimized planning, again, computers can do a lot of stuff. They can help here. They can say, you can ask a computer, say, we've got all these wells we would like to drill, but we don't want to have this mishmash of roads and seismic lines and everything happening everywhere. Give me an optimized plan. Give me a road network that connects as many of the dots as possible, but leaves lots of green space. So their way of looking at 65 is not the protect like a park kind of idea that I mentioned to you under the triage. It's more of within every range, we'll have some fingers of development, but big areas of intactness in between them. Next, now we come to that second question. Is this going to work? See, nobody's ever done this. I think it's a great thing that we're moving forward for not just caribou, for all species to have more intact habitat. But will it actually maintain caribou? Nobody knows, because this experiment has never been done. We'll find out. The other piece I mentioned is part of this plan was aggregated harvest. So in a conventional, shown here on the left, conventional forest harvesting, that's all these different colored blocks here are clear cuts. Okay, and in the past, the conventional way is dispersed harvest. It was they could take a little bit from everywhere. The different colors represent different decades. So in decade 1, years 1 to 10 is pink. So they'd be driving all over the whole map planning area, taking a little bit from everywhere. There's some good reasons to that, but from caribou, it means that a large proportion of the landscape is being disturbed at any given time. So this new idea of aggregated harvest is to pump everything in years 1 to 10 goes here, then we go here, then we go here, and you allow the rest of it to stay intact. And by the time this kind of grows up, then you finally start moving in here. So this is another strategy of concentrating the impact so that we have undisturbed habitat maintained at a high percentage of the area, the 65% target over the long term. Again, will it work? These are ideas, I don't know. A third piece that they had was protected areas. So these purple areas were proposed protected areas you can see here, each one are in caribou ranges. So we're going to make back to the triage. And in fact, I'm not going to roll it back, but if you looked at those areas that I showed you of high probability of, they are these areas. And why are they areas? Because there's very little resource value up here. There's some, but compared to everywhere else, it's really low. There's not a lot of activity out there. It's pretty intact. It's good for climate. They're pretty good areas. So they were actually formally proposed as part of this 2017 thing. Only there was a problem. You see, from a provincial perspective, having a set of parks where there's low value makes a lot of sense. But for the people living there, this is Mackenzie County, they said, you know what, you can take your grand trade-offs and your large scale planning and stuff it, because we live here and we don't like this. So there was something, I think it was 9,000 people put their names on a petition, a large proportion. There's only about 20,000 people live there in the whole region. And the county was behind it, the municipal government, and got these people to sign up and stuff. And they said, no, we don't want, not that anybody was actually talking about foreclosing, like shutting down mills or shutting down oil and gas. It was, they thought, in the future, someday we might go there. And so we want to have that ability. And you can, like I say, you can take your trade-offs, go somewhere else, go talk to the people at Fort McMurray, but we don't want it. And they were very clear about it. And the government blinked. That was all it took, 9,000 people. And that protected area agenda was off the map. Okay, moving on. I'm rambling and taking too long, so I'll move forward here. Third problem is that when you actually look at where the herds are today and how much disturbance, these are our 14 herds. This is how much undisturbed habitat. This is your threshold. You've got a long ways. You've got a lot of restoration. What does restoration mean? You got to grow trees. This is a forest, and trees don't grow quickly. So even if you start today, it's going to take a long time. Their solution: shoot wolves, because that will keep the caribou alive long enough for the restoration to have an effect. Well, there's some questions around that. Wolf control is intended. It's true. If we don't kill the wolves, some of those herds probably already would be, if not extirpated, but very nearly. So they started in Little Smoky. 7 ranges are now, wolves are being shot, poisoned, and so on every year. So that's how we are in the short term doing it. Has it worked? Mostly, yes. The herds, they were declining every year steadily to oblivion. Now, most of them are stable, maybe a little bit of positive growth. Questions. The third question, is this a good idea? It's a real ethical dilemma. What you get viable caribou so that hopefully eventually they habitat restoration will do its trick and you'll have viable herds again and you can stop killing them. But for now, it's pretty rotten. People have questioned, especially the poisons, because there's you're killing other species besides wolves. Is it the whole ethics of it? We're distorting the whole predator-prey system. That's an issue. Perhaps the biggest one, though, it depends. Everybody has a different view. Most of the conservation groups, they hate the idea, but they haven't argued too strongly against it because it's true. Without wolf control in the short term, these herds probably will not survive. Anyway, one thing that's really come apparent now in the last few years is there's just not been that really clear reciprocity. Again, is the government really, the quid pro quo here was we kill some wolves, but we go really hard on restoration. Okay, well, where's the beef? Have we reclaimed a single road since? It's been 5 years now, have we? No, not a single road. There's been seismic restoration. The government has started. Is it huge scale? No, it's a couple townships there, a couple townships elsewhere. So it's happening. But, is it at the appropriate rate? It's hard to say. There is no plan. You can't, something we should actually ask for is what I'm thinking is, show us the plan. Are we on a 1,000-year plan, at the rate of restoration, or is it a 50-year plan? They should be able to tell us that, whether are we really getting something for all this wolf killing? The biggest problem to my mind, this is what really bothers me, is at the same time, and you have to remember, government is not a monolith. There are different, departments, and they work against each other sometimes. So you have wildlife managers trying to, do what they can for caribou. And then we have the minister at the time, he said, you know what, I think that's a good idea. Let's increase forest harvesting by 30%. So, you can't do that at the same time in this whole straight face. It's disingenuous, right? At one hand, they're saying, we're going to do all this stuff. We're going to kill wolves, stand by. Oh, we're going to increase force. Well, that's the death knell for caribou. There's a real deep problem there. Okay, couple more slides and I'm done. Where are we today? I view this as Trudeau's dilemma. Species at Risk Act requires his government, to deal with this. Sarah has their policies, and Sarah requires something to happen. But does Trudeau want to walk into, Alberta? This is the land of the Sovereignty Act. So the last thing that Trudeau wants to do is start a fight with, Danielle Smith or, whoever. And at the other side, he's in a rock and a hard place. So he doesn't want to have that fight with the province. But Sarah is forcing him. And I think there's some vulnerability there that they've kind of given it some time. They said, okay, you've got this 2017 plan. Let's see how it goes. But ultimately, something has to happen. So we're going to see in the next couple of years, I think, hopefully some action on their part, but it will take time. Certainly the government, Alberta's perspective was clear. This is a quote, this is a uniquely Alberta's solution. Oh yeah, we'll look for an Alberta solution, i.e. the last 30 years was pretty good. We'll do that some more. So we will not have anybody impose on us how we're going to deal with caribou, right? So there's a fight here. It's a bare knuckle fist fight, feds against Alberta. Will it happen? I don't know. We did negotiate an agreement. Like I say, that's why there's this pause right now, but eventually something has to happen. And we have caribou task forces. Yeah, 30 years of them, that's what we're doing again. And, people are working really hard at, the conservationists are there at the table trying really hard to move things forward. But again, at the same time, you've got the minister increasing the rate of forestry. So, geez, are we being played? I always have that question in my mind. But, it's arguably maybe the only game in town other than maybe trying the feds. It's hard to say. I just wanted to end here with one thing, Triage Revisited. I was a proponent at the time. I was, thought this is a really good idea. I've changed my tune on that. Why? Because I've been convinced now that caribou probably are our best bet at ever getting a real cumulative effects management strategy in the province, which we desperately need for all species, not just caribou, right? Caribou, we did that in the land use framework and it all fell apart. It just all got too complicated. And then the whole thing just crushed under its own weight. And now through caribou, it's a really crystal clear thing. 65% caribou dead or alive, right? It focuses your attention. And so I'm thinking, you know, if you lose a herd, the Little Smoky, if they're gone, all the cumulative effects work, all the seismic regen that's going on there now, it stops. It really will, because the driver behind all this was caribou. So I've thought, you know what, we did wrong when we did the triage. I think it still makes sense to optimize your resources, but we focused too narrowly just on caribou. Say what's right for caribou. If you just put the circle around caribou, maybe protecting it in the north is the best solution. But if you look at all species, and you widen your lens, you say, what's best for all species? Then maybe the most important thing is to keep caribou alive for as long as we can, because you're getting all these other benefits. So I just wanted to note that you know, triage is a tricky concept, and I've certainly changed my thinking on that. Trouble is, implementation is still pending. So even with caribou, we're still not really getting that, you know, that optimized road network. You know, it's still an idea on paper. So ending off, what can you do? Role for naturalists. I'm thinking we should start working collectively to demand the feds to get involved. I know I just said they don't want to, but that doesn't mean we can just let them off the hook. You know, we've got critical habitat, that there is a policy that says you cannot destroy critical habitat. And yet we are every day, you know, new clear cuts, new roads going in. How can they do that? I don't think that they have a leg to stand on if we make some noise around that. So that's one possibility. Within the province, I think we've got to make more noise about no increase in forest harvesting rates. It's wrong for many reasons. I find it so disheartening. I spent, you know, I think Kathy said I've been at it 30 years. A lot of that has been spent on land use planning and cumulative effects and stuff like that. I'm feeling like my life's work is being unwound year by year here, especially in the last 4 years, as we worked on ecosystem management and sustainable, you know, ecosystems in terms of how much harvesting is appropriate and how it's done and all that, and it's just being thrown out the window. So I think through caribou and other, you know, drivers, we need to really push against any increase in forest harvesting. Third, I think we need to demand more meaningful progress on restoration and that optimized access. You know, if we're killing wolves, we need to see that side, and we can't, you know, just be okay with this status quo of killing and really low level of restoration. Fourth, we're always looking for support. Other groups, AWA and CPAWS have been working much longer than us and harder. So, you know, support them and you know, do what you can in terms of you know, providing support for all these people that are trying their best to move things forward. And last but not least, hey, we've got an election coming up, you know, in a month and a half, or I think May 29th. You know, we're a charity. I can't tell you who to vote for. I've got to tell you, vote for nature. And, you know, I think if we all think of it that way, that we need a better balance, we can make a big difference. That's probably the biggest thing an individual can do right now going forward. So I'll end off there. Learn more. We've got a section on conservation action. And on our website, you see it's called Protect Nature. There's a blog. You know, most of what I talked about here today was coming from an article I wrote last in the current issue. So I encourage you, if you're interested in these kind of things, you'll find a lot of good information. We spend time on the analysis, like behind the scenes, like what I showed you today in terms of nature conservation. So if you want more, we've got it there for you. If you're a person that really wants a deep dive, this originated with a case study in the text I wrote 4 years ago. It's available on the Nature Alberta website at a reduced cost. And in about a month, I've got a free open text version of it. It'll be at the University of Alberta Library. And so if you know somebody who really wants to dig into conservation and learn you know, all of these details, you know, I encourage you to go there. And with that, I'll end it and open for questions. I'm happy to answer any that anybody has.
Rick, on behalf of everyone here today, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us about caribou conservation in Alberta and the problems around it. I will stop the recording now.